Imagine, high above the ground, at the dangerous height of scaffolding, a heart-stopping story begins. The white foreman looks coldly at the black electrician and, with a haughty grin, points out the risky task, knowing full well that the job is life-threatening. The electrician hesitates, but the foreman does not tolerate refusals. Hi friends, before we dive into this story, let's get to know each other. Write in the comments what your name is and where you're watching this video from. We see each and every one of you, and your presence is really important to us. It is you, our viewers, who help us promote this channel by supporting our stories that we create for you. We are grateful for each and every one of you. Your support and comments inspire us and help us tell even more stories like this. Thank you for being with us and for sharing our videos. We really appreciate you, and it's more than just words. Enjoy the show. Through the early morning fog, the construction site looked like a maze of steel bars and concrete blocks rising into the sky like ghostly silhouettes. The air was filled with the deafening clatter of hammers, the howling of drills, and the sharp shouts of foremen. Every day on this site is a struggle for speed and quality, for meeting deadlines that seem almost impossible. The construction site came to life like a huge organism, each element of which obeyed a strict schedule, absorbed in the goal of erecting a new building, raising it floor by floor above the bustling city. The height at which the workers were working was not forgiving of mistakes. Up there, the steel scaffolding seemed unstable and the support fragile and shaky. Any wrong step, the slightest deviation could turn into a fatal mistake. Every day the builders climbed to the place where the distance to the ground became a terrible abyss. The cold wind cut their faces, causing goosebumps on their skin, and even the most experienced one's hands were trembling. The light of the sun, barely breaking through the clouds of dust and construction debris, reflected off the metal, blinding and making you squint. The workers were focused, tense, concentrated on their tasks. Any little thing could have been a matter of life and death. The foreman, whose name was Harry Wilson, was a man of special status on the site. Tall, with sharp features and a cold gaze, he knew how to keep order with a loud voice and a firm grip. Harry always wore a bright yellow hard hat, by which he could be seen from afar, and it seemed that the workers tried to stay away from him. He was in the habit of ignoring the fatigue of his subordinates and insisting that the work go faster no matter what the conditions. For him, results came first, no matter how they were achieved. Harry had a sharp and demanding character. He was a man for whom it was important to show that he was always right, that his authority was an immutable fact. Those who tried to argue or talk about security conditions invariably drew his contempt. For him, security was a secondary issue, especially when deadlines began to loom and questions began to pile up behind the leadership. The electrician, named Mark Taylor, seemed calmer and more composed in front of Harry. Mark was an experienced technician who knew what safety was and why it shouldn't be ignored. He wasn't the kind of man who could just follow orders without thinking about the consequences. A black worker with a good-natured smile but a keen, attentive eye, he had worked on construction sites for years and knew the importance of following the rules, especially at height. Mark was confident, but always respectful of his co-workers, avoiding conflict. Nevertheless, the atmosphere between him and Harry had long been strained. Harry was irritated by Mark's calmness and judgment, his refusal to perform dangerous tasks without the proper conditions, and his confidence that he could do things differently. Harry considered Mark a slow and inconvenient worker, but Mark, accustomed to asserting his rights and self-respect, was not about to sacrifice safety for someone else's ambitions. So, on a dusty construction site in the middle of a workday, they both approached a new round of tense confrontation in which safety and respect for human life collided with the brutal practice of ignoring those notions. Harry Wilson always looked down on the workers as mere tools to do his bidding. He knew that his word was law on the site, and none of the workers had the authority, or, as he believed, the courage to challenge him. Harry had long since gotten used to this position. He didn't care what the people around him thought or felt. All that mattered was to meet the deadline. Anyone who didn't keep to that rhythm automatically became his weak links. Mark, on the other hand, was one of those who refused to be a wordless enforcer. Despite Harry's attempts to put him in his place, he continued to insist on safe conditions, always asking if the anchorages were secure and making sure the equipment was in working order. This annoyed Harry. His strained relationship with Mark was almost a personal challenge for him. Mark, with his adamant principle of putting life and health before speed, was disrupting the foreman's usual routine. In this unequal game, Harry had all the power. He handed out assignments, punished disobedience, promoted or demoted people in the eyes of management. Whenever Mark raised safety concerns or complained about dangerous conditions, Harry only grinned and responded dismissively, as if they were minor quirks. He always stuck to his guns. Subordinates were here to work, not argue with their superiors. Mark's position on the construction site was far less stable. As a temporary employee and only one of dozens of workers, he could not openly contradict the foreman without risking unemployment. But Mark knew the value of his experience and respect for himself. So even though he was threatened with losing his position, he never agreed to Harry's unfair orders. This balance of power and dependence gave Harry a sense of impunity. He knew that most of the workers feared him and rarely objected. In the eyes of management, he was still a valuable man who could keep order and meet deadlines. And it was this that encouraged Harry to think that he could afford any cruelty, for he felt that his power could not be shaken by anyone or anything. Harry was especially tense this day. The deadline was looming, and there wasn't much time left to meet it. He had plenty of reason to worry. His superiors were already demanding reports, and the construction seemed to be going slower than he would have liked. In an attempt to make up for lost time, Harry began handing out tasks without regard for the level of danger. He felt that everyone should just do their jobs and not ask too many questions. When Mark went up to the second level of the scaffolding to check another wire, Harry quickly approached him and, without further ado, pointed to a spot above the roof where one of the loose wiring boxes was visible. "Taylor, your job today is to connect the power to the main panel on the upper level," Harry commanded, trying not to give the electrician time to think. "It's an urgent and necessary job, or we won't be able to finish this stage on time." Mark looked at the foreman, and then at the spot he had indicated. The panel was at the very edge of the platform, and the job required pulling cables while standing at the very edge of the scaffolding. One glance was enough to realize that the structure was rickety, the anchorages untested, and there was nothing underfoot to support him in case he fell. "Harry, it's dangerous. There's no insurance on this scaffolding, and you can only get to that panel with the right equipment. We need to prepare the site," Mark said carefully, trying to explain the situation. But Harry only grinned, not wanting to hear the explanation. "Taylor, we don't have time for your nagging. This job has to be done today, and you have to do it." He looked straight into Mark's eyes, giving him no chance to object. Mark felt a wave of irritation and fear wash over him. He knew that his refusal would only bring Harry contempt, but he wasn't about to risk his life for the sake of urgency. "Safety is more important than timing, Harry. If we don't check the anchorages and provide insurance, this could end badly," Mark said calmly, trying to keep his emotions in check. But Harry wasn't listening. He stood with his arms crossed, looking at him as if he were a stubborn teenager, not an experienced electrician. "It's your job, and I'm not going to wait for you to argue with me," he mouthed. and then added, squeezing the words out of anger, "Either you do it, or look for another construction site." Mark knew it was futile to argue, and he could feel himself boiling up inside, but he couldn't afford to risk his life for the whims of the foreman. Mark looked at the rickety scaffolding, at the bare wires that dangled from the edges, and felt a chill of fear run down his spine. This mission could turn tragic. He knew the value of safety at such heights, and had seen what happened when someone neglected safety precautions. He believed in his qualifications and experience, but the risk was too great even for him. "Harry," Mark said, trying to stay calm, though his voice sounded firm. "I can't do this. It's too dangerous. The scaffolding isn't secured, there's no insurance, and the equipment hasn't even been checked. We need training before we can work at this height." Harry's eyes flashed with surprise for a moment. He hadn't expected anyone to dare refuse him, not even to his face. The expression quickly changed to cold contempt, and the corners of his lips curved into a sarcastic grin. "Are you refusing to work?" he growled, barely containing his irritation. "Do you realize you're letting the whole team down? We can't waste time because you're suddenly scared. This is your job, and you have to do it like everyone else." Mark took a deep breath, realizing that the foreman had no intention of discussing safety. Harry was determined and wasn't going to take no for an answer. "I'm not going to risk my life for a deadline that can be accomplished safely if you approach the task wisely," Mark replied firmly, looking Harry straight in the eye. "If we don't prepare the scaffolding and check the equipment, it's a straight path to an accident, and I am not going to be a part of that." The words finally made Harry lose his temper. His face was red, his gaze hard and cold, like the stare of a cornered predator. "Look, Taylor," Harry gritted through his teeth, taking a step closer. "You're here to follow orders, not to argue about what's safe and what's not. If you don't like it, get out of here and look for a job somewhere else. But as long as you're here, you're going to do what I say. Understand?" Mark stood firm, not averting his gaze or yielding under the pressure. He knew he couldn't argue with this man, but he also knew that no one else would keep him safe but himself. Harry could threaten all he wanted, but Mark was determined to stand his ground, even if it meant losing his job. "I'm sorry, Harry, but I won't do it," he said quietly but firmly, then turned away and began to gather his tools, signaling that the decision had been made. At that moment, he had no idea that his calm refusal would only fuel the fire and provoke Harry into an act that would change everything. Harry felt his rage boiling over, refusing to settle. He couldn't believe that Mark had dared to defy him like that in front of the other workers, who were already beginning to cast furtive glances in their direction, pretending to continue their work. This open defiance hurt his pride, and he was determined to put the electrician in his place. "You have no idea what you're doing, Taylor," he said, clenching his teeth and lowering his voice so that it was almost an ominous whisper. "Do you think that if you say no, it's going to make anyone feel better?" Harry stepped closer, looking at Mark as if he intended to crush him with a single glance. "This is your last warning. You either take this job and do it, or I'll make sure you can't work on any more construction sites. Understand?" Mark endured the icy stare and did not avert his calm but firm eyes in response. He knew Harry had the power to make his job unbearable, but he was sure he was doing the right thing by refusing to risk his life for the foreman's ambitions. He realized the pressure was immense, but his experience and instinct told him a step to the side would give in now, and it would open the way for even greater risks in the future. "Harry, if you're in such a hurry, maybe you can handle this on your own," Mark threw in, trying not to let his excitement give him away. "I'm not here to put myself at risk for your personal interests." The words made Harry literally explode. He grabbed Mark's hand, clenching it so hard his knuckles turned white. "Listen to me," he hissed, lowering his voice ominously so the others couldn't hear. "You don't realize the position you're in. Do you think any of these people are going to support you? They're here for the same thing you are, to work, and they'll do anything to hold on to their positions. So stop playing the hero." Mark carefully released his hand, not taking his eyes off Harry's furious face. He knew that one more step and the situation could get out of hand. He could feel the tension thickening around them, like hot air before a thunderstorm. He was well aware that Harry wasn't going to stop at just words anymore. "I said everything I wanted to say," Mark replied calmly. "It's dangerous. I won't do it." The words hung in the air, inflaming the situation to the limit. There was silence for a moment, and the construction site itself seemed to freeze, waiting to see what would happen next. Harry straightened up slowly, but his eyes burned with hatred and determination. Harry could barely contain his anger, but now, instead of simply demanding obedience, he decided to go further, using his preconceived notions to finally put Mark in his place. He'd always disliked the electrician, not just because of his bluntness and unwillingness to compromise, but because of something else Harry would never admit out loud. He looked down at Mark, a look of contempt and blatant superiority on his face. His gaze reflected everything he thought about Mark and how he judged him, without even touching the question of professionalism. To Harry, Mark was different, and that irritated him to the core. "Of course you won't," Harry said mockingly, emphasizing each word. "You're always looking for ways to get away, aren't you? Just so you don't have to take any responsibility. Somehow I can trust the others, but you're always trying to break the system, question my judgment." Mark felt indignation rising in him, but he held back, not letting his emotions take control. He knew that such words were not accidental, that Harry was trying to hurt him, to undermine his self-esteem and professional reputation. It was no longer just a demand to perform a dangerous task. Harry was trying to question Mark's very worth as a man, as an employee. "My decision to refuse has to do with security," Mark replied, trying to keep his voice even, though there was a note of steel in his voice. "You can say whatever you want, Harry, but it doesn't change the fact that your order is a direct threat to life." But Harry didn't stop, sensing that he had found a vulnerable spot. His voice grew louder, as if he wanted everyone around him to hear him. "Oh, is that so? Safety, you say? You're just looking for an excuse not to do it. I guess working at this height and with this level of responsibility isn't something you can handle," he said, with a chuckle. "Maybe you shouldn't be on this site at all if you're so concerned about your safety." He emphasized the word security with a sneer, making it clear that he considered it an insignificant excuse. He had a look of contempt on his face, as if Mark were a second-rate employee who deserved neither trust nor respect. To Mark, those words were an insult. He knew that Harry had always seen him not only as a professional, but as someone who couldn't be allowed to do too much. But he also knew that Harry wouldn't dare speak to others like that, wouldn't dare humiliate or undermine their professionalism like that. Mark looked at Harry directly and firmly. There was no fear in his eyes, but a deep weariness and a realization that this conflict went beyond the usual argument about work. It was an internal conflict where Mark stood in defense of his principles and Harry stood in a position of power and prejudice, ready to go to any humiliation to prove his superiority. Time seemed to stand still in the tension that hung between them. Harry didn't back down, and the look in his cold eyes became angrier and more focused. He stepped closer, pushing Mark closer to the edge of the roof, like a hunted animal that refused to play by his rules. At this point, Harry no longer cared about safety, or even the possible consequences. The only thought pulsing in his head was to show that stubborn electrician who was boss. "I'll tell you what's going on here, if you still don't get it," Harry hissed, stepping close again. The only people up here are those who can obey and do what's required of them. If they can't, they're out of the game, and you made your own choice today." His hand grabbed Mark's shoulder roughly and pulled him to the side, and in that instant it was clear what Harry was about to do. Mark tried to keep his balance, but the sudden jerk knocked him off his feet. It all happened in a matter of seconds. Mark clung to the edge of the roof, trying to stay aloft, and felt the foreman's efforts to knock the last chance of escape out of his hands. A smile of cruel satisfaction flashed across Harry's face. But the moment he bent over to finally get rid of his weak link, something unexpected happened. The pipe, barely holding on to the fasteners behind his back, cracked under the pressure. There was a loud crunch of metal, and the next second a torrent of dirty cold water rushed out with a deafening noise, crashing straight down on Harry. It all happened too fast. The powerful jet that burst from the pipe knocked Harry off his feet slipping instantly on the wet edge of the roof. Muddy water slammed into his face, and he didn't even have time to scream as his panic-stricken body flew downward. Mark, still clinging to the edge of the roof, watched in horror as his tormentor, balancing, tried in vain to hold on to the slippery edge. But the inertia and the rushing water left him no chance. In that second, Harry, sensing his own powerlessness, realized that the control he had been so proud of was now nothing. His fate depended on the very piece of metal he had neglected in his pursuit of deadlines. Mark watched the foreman disappear over the edge of the roof, swallowed up by the merciless height that no longer distinguished who was in charge. The muddy stream, like a symbolic judge, washed Harry down, exposing his vulnerability and the fleeting nature of his brutal power. Mark was still standing at the edge of the scaffolding, feeling like he was on a knife edge, when the next moment Harry, waking from his shock, seemed to explode with a new wave of rage. Just then, he nearly fell over himself, but the momentary fear was quickly replaced by uncontrollable anger. He couldn't afford to lose in this power struggle, especially in front of this unruly electrician. His face, contorted with hatred, seemed incapable of anything human. "You think it's that easy? You think you can just give up your job and walk away?" he hissed, stepping forward, his eyes burning with a dangerous glint. "I'll show you how it works." With a sudden rough movement, Harry shoved Mark, as if he wanted to wipe away the confidence that had so infuriated him. Mark, caught off guard, jerked back, balancing on the edge of the scaffolding, his arms instinctively reaching out to find a foothold. But in that instant, there was nothing secure to hold on to. The structure beneath him swayed, as if the platform itself were also hostage to their desperate conflict. Time seemed to stand still. The seconds stretched out, turning what was happening into a terrible, endless moment. Mark, balancing on the verge of falling, looked straight into the foreman's eyes, as if asking in silent horror, was he really ready to go all the way? A sense of danger pulsed through every cell of his body, adrenaline pounding in his temples, slowing his perception. He realized that Harry had crossed the line and realized that this man was really ready to remove him as an obstacle. But instead of backing away, Harry, driven by rage, took another step forward and, lips curling into a gloating grin, shoved Mark sharply in the chest. The jerk, made with full intent, was powerful and cold in its ferocity. Harry's face was frozen in an expression of ruthless satisfaction, as if he had finally gotten what he wanted. Mark felt his body lose its footing, the ground slipping away from under his feet in an instant. He gripped the air helplessly with his hands, but the woods were getting farther away, and Harry was just a blurry shadow overhead. His heart was pounding so loudly that it seemed like it might burst. His fall lasted a moment, but it was an eternity, filled with despair, fear, and a distinct realization of the betrayal he had fallen victim to. Everything around him turned into silent chaos. Mark felt the cold air tearing his skin, and the world around him became a blurred mass of scaffolding, debris, and gray sky that hung over him like a mute void. The fall was instantaneous and irreversible, but it was as if his consciousness had torn that moment into countless shards. Time seemed to slow down, giving him seconds filled with a piercing realization of horror. His hands reflexively darted to his sides, trying to grab onto anything that might slow his fall. His fingers clung desperately to the metal beams and rebar, but they slipped on the cold steel, leaving only burns and scratches. The deafening clang of metal against metal, the clang of his helmet bouncing off the scaffolding, echoed in his ears, mingling with the wild pounding of his own heart. Mark realized that the height was too great, that this fall would probably be his last, but his body was still struggling, instinctively clinging to every chance. His feet flashed through the air, and at one point he felt the sole of his boot catch on a bar of rebar, barely slowing his fall. It gave him a split second, but only long enough for his hand to find some kind of ledge on which he tried to pile his body. For a moment it seemed that he had stopped, that he had managed to catch hold of the edge, but his fingers, weakened by fear and exhausted by the cold, slipped, and he flew down again. This time, there was nothing left to stop him. He could feel the ground approaching inexorably, and he could no longer control the fear or the pain that slashed his body from hitting the scaffolding. In his last moments, Mark closed his eyes. Despair and humility struggled inside him, and, as if in a farewell rush, the faces of the family he had left at home, the friends with whom he had shared the hard work, and even some happy moments that suddenly flashed into his mind. The construction site was completely silent for a few moments. Each of the workers who had accidentally or unwittingly witnessed this terrible fall stood as if paralyzed, stunned by the scene that had played out before their eyes. The hum and noise of the work had subsided, as if the construction site itself was holding its breath, absorbing the horror of what had happened. One of the older workers, Joe, a man who had seen many tragedies on construction sites, tried to shout for help, but his voice trailed off and the words drowned in his parched throat. He headed toward the edge of the scaffolding, hoping to see where Mark had fallen, but fear restrained his steps. He couldn't bring himself to move closer, feeling that the scene he would see below would be too much for him to bear. Meanwhile, someone ran to the foreman, who stood motionless, his face as pale as a sheet. Harry was petrified, watching as his actions led to a terrible, irreparable tragedy. But there was no fear or regret in his eyes, just a blank expression, as if he hadn't yet realized, or didn't want to realize, that he had caused Mark's fall. The workers, gradually realizing the gravity of what had happened, began to whisper louder. Some said indignantly that such a thing had never happened before. Some cursed the unreliable scaffolding. Some glanced at Harry, realizing his guilt was obvious but afraid to say it out loud. Panic and disbelief at what they had just seen filled the atmosphere with thick fear, as if everyone felt as if their world had just been turned upside down. With each passing moment, the tension on the site was building. People were beginning to look at Harry not as the foreman, but as the perpetrator of a tragedy that nothing could justify. Harry finally felt the eyes on him, heavy, accusing, like searchlights directed at him. He knew that his every action would now be scrutinized under a microscope. The foreman forced himself to take a deep breath, trying to suppress a shudder, and adopted a naively cold and collected expression. Now that the eyes of the surrounding workers were fixed on him, he could not afford to show weakness. He had to act now, or he would lose control of the situation and suffer unpredictable consequences. All right," he shouted, stepping forward and waving his hands as if to dispel the fog of panic that had taken hold of the workers' minds. All those who had nothing to do with the incident, return to your seats. Work continues." His voice sounded harsh, even rough, and this harshness was clearly out of keeping with the anxious silence that still hung over the construction site. But his words did not bring back the calm. On the contrary, the workers only tensed more, their faces expressing both fear and confusion. "Listen to me carefully," Harry continued, trying not to meet the eyes of those closest to the edge where it had happened. This accident was entirely Mark's fault. He had been warned to watch out for his own safety. All responsibility lies with him, and him alone. These words seemed to stun the workers. Several men looked at each other in bewilderment. No one could believe that Harry, who had just seen Mark fall from a height, had shown no sympathy, but had spoken of the fault of the dead man. There was indignation on people's faces, but fear of the foreman kept them from open protest. Mark knew that safety was paramount, Harry continued with feigned confidence, as if rehearsing his version of events. But he was, once again, incompetent. You all know how he disregarded instructions, refused to follow directions. He always thought he knew best how and what to do. This is the result. The foreman was deliberately raising his voice, giving the workers his own version of what had happened. He hoped that by suppressing their outrage with his commanding tone, he could shift the focus from his own actions to Mark's alleged shortcomings. His words were full of cynicism and cold calculation, as if he had been preparing this speech for a long time, so that if necessary he could make up for any incident involving an inconvenient employee. But now, among the silent faces of the workers, there were more and more frequent glances of distrust and condemnation. At last, someone could not bear it and said quietly, almost in a whisper, "But everyone saw that you pushed him." Harry glared at the one who dared to speak up, but quickly replaced his anger with a smug expression. "I remind you all that if anyone questions my instructions, they can always look for another job," he said coldly, looking at everyone without blinking an eye. "I will not tolerate sabotage on my construction site." This threat hung in the air, besieging the workers and bringing them back into the grip of fear. But now that fear was gradually growing into a quiet, hidden indignation that was yet to grow into something more. "Did you see that?" whispered one of the young workers to his partner, looking around to make sure Harry couldn't hear. Harry shoved him himself. Mark didn't even resist, just wanting to do his job safely. "Yes," his partner said quietly, lowering his voice. It was no accident. The foreman was clearly going for it. He'd been angry with Mark since the day he'd refused to do those dangerous tasks. The workers looked around, but their eyes no longer expressed mere fear. Now it was a heavy, almost conscious indignation, mixed with disbelief and a sharp bitterness at the realization that their world was far more cruel and unjust than they had thought. "I always knew there was something wrong with this, Harry," a senior worker named Joe spoke quietly, joining the small group. "But something like this, Christ, it's murder. It's murder, and now he's trying to blame it on Mark to protect himself." The word murder, Joe said, seemed to strike a nerve. It hung in the air, scary and real, making everyone acutely aware of what had happened. They had all seen what had happened, seen how Harry had gotten too close, how he had deliberately pushed Mark off the scaffolding. Everyone realized that this was not an accident, not incompetence as the foreman tried to portray it. It was a reprisal against someone who dared to go against his ruthless orders. "Do you know why he was so angry with Mark?" Suddenly intervened one of the experienced electricians who often worked next to Mark. "Because Mark didn't keep quiet. He always told Harry to his face when something was dangerous. Didn't tolerate his threats and disregard for safety. Harry couldn't stand anyone questioning his decisions." The voices intensified, whispering into a muffled but open conversation that could not go unnoticed. In every word, there was a growing condemnation. The workers realized that Harry had not only pushed Mark from the heights, but had done it deliberately eliminating the weak link, as he called it, so that no one on the site would dare to go against his methods. "None of us are safe as long as there are men like him here," Joe muttered, and his words were matched by silent approval. It was a bitter realization that loomed over each of them. Each felt complicit in not speaking out sooner, not paying attention to the foreman's behavior. Now they realized that it wasn't just cruelty, it was a message to everyone that no one could expect justice or safety as long as men like Harry were at the helm. The realization of the tragedy stirred in the workers not only fear and indignation, but also a deep-seated sense of injustice that had been building up for a long time. They exchanged silent glances, and each realized that this was not just one man's cruelty. There was something more behind Harry's act, something that had poisoned the atmosphere on the site for all those months: prejudice, hidden contempt, and an attitude that treated some people as expendable. "Look who usually gets the toughest and most dangerous jobs," one of the older workers, a man named Carl, who had known Harry for a long time, said quietly. "The ones who don't ask questions, who are willing to work and keep quiet." And Mark, he'd always been in favor of safety, of fair treatment. Maybe that's why Harry decided to take him out. Carl's words caused a grim realization among the others. Everyone remembered how Harry had treated those who were different from the majority, how he'd given himself disparaging glances, caustic remarks thrown in passing when Mark and other workers who didn't fit his idea of reliable employees came into his field of vision. The black electrician who demanded safety and respect proved to be something of an annoying obstacle for Harry. He could not be ignored, and his refusal to obey the foreman's rules was the last straw. "Harry always treated Mark like he was worth less," Joe added quietly, trying to suppress a lump in his throat. He didn't see him as a man, as a professional. To him, Mark was a kind of unruly, inferior element, and when he refused to perform a dangerous task, Harry couldn't stand it. These words awakened new thoughts in the workers. This was not just a tragedy, it was a blatant case of prejudice and discrimination in the most brutal form. Everyone began to recall moments when Harry seemed to deliberately treat Mark worse than others. Mocking comments, careless instructions, and outright disregard for his concerns came to mind. Why were we silent for so long? The voice of one of the young workers sounded muffled and doomed. We all saw what he was doing to him. We knew it was unfair, but we were afraid to say a word. The silence grew heavier as each of them realized that they had been unwitting witnesses, silent accomplices in allowing this injustice to become a tragedy. Harry's bias now seemed to them to be more than just a personal conflict. It revealed the harsh truth of how, in places like this, prejudice against others becomes the norm, and the acquiescence of others only reinforces that injustice. And all because Mark was different from us, Carl summarized sadly, his words hanging in the air. Mark's tragedy was a symbol of how unfair and cruel a place can be, where only those with power and prejudice have a say. The day's events were a painful reminder to the workers of how easy it is to neglect something that should be inviolable on any construction site: safety. And now, in the silence and tension that loomed over the site, that realization flared especially sharp. Mark wasn't just a good technician, he was one of the few who actually cared about worker safety. He knew the cost of inattention, dangerous conditions, and the delicate balance between life and death that each of them faced on a daily basis. For him, safety was not just a set of rules. It was a law that he believed to be inviolable, and therefore was willing to uphold even in the face of stern and unwavering superiors. Now, having lost Mark, Many workers realized that his demands were not unnecessary precautions or whims. He defended them all, even those who may not have shared his caution. If he hadn't fought for safety, maybe he would have been left alone, said one of the workers, standing at the very edge of the scaffolding, bitterly. He knew that poor anchorages, lack of insurance, and overloaded scaffolding were dangerous, and he talked about it even when the foreman didn't like it. The others nodded silently, realizing that they often made concessions without thinking of the consequences, hoping for luck. They were used to taking risks, used to being in a hurry, used to Harry always pushing them without regard for safety standards. In the back of their minds, they realized that with this approach, each of them was in danger. Today, it was Mark. But tomorrow, who knows who might be next? The supervisors here are supposed to keep us safe. Joe's voice was low but firm. It's their direct responsibility. Harry was supposed to protect us, but instead he turned our work into a risky ordeal. When a supervisor thinks that work is more important than human life, it's no longer a construction site, but a trap. Those words raised a heavy wave of truth. Harry, as the boss, had all the power and responsibility to make sure their labor was safe. It was his duty to ensure that they could return home to their families each day without fear for their lives. But he neglected that duty, seeing safety only as a hindrance to his goal. Now, standing at the edge of the scaffolding and looking down where the tragedy had occurred, the workers realized that their silence had encouraged his negligence, and they realized that if they didn't start asserting their right to safe conditions, sooner or later, Harry or others like him could leave their families without breadwinners. Mark's tragedy should be a lesson, brutal but vital. The events of that day deeply shook everyone on the site. Although Mark's tragedy was a blatant example of a safety violation, people realized that the problem was much deeper than negligence and disregard for safety. It was a question of how people were treated, how much respect superiors had for their subordinates, and how much each of them was truly valued as human beings. Harry had always looked down on the workers, dividing them into those who were convenient and those who were troublemakers. Those who accepted risky tasks without objection suited him. They just worked, without question or demand. And those who dared to voice their opinions, especially if it concerned their safety and well-being, became his weak links. And Mark, a black electrician with strong principles and dignity, was a bone of contention for Harry. Many people realized that Mark was paying a high price for his courage. He was not prepared to silently accept injustice and neglect, and such people always stood out. Mark demanded respect, not only because of his experience and professionalism, but also because he believed that every person on this construction site deserved to be heard and protected. He believed that his right to be safe and treated with dignity did not depend on the color of his skin or his job title. Joe, standing among the workers, spoke a thought that had been in the air but which no one dared to voice. If each of us were treated with respect, if we were listened to and heard, no job would be a mortal risk, he said, looking at the others. We are all worthy of respect. It doesn't matter who we are or where we come from. Everyone's lives are equally important. These words made many people think. They realized that equality was not just a pretty principle. It was the basis for each worker to know that he or she was valued not just for speed and efficiency, but as a person, a human being with thoughts, feelings, and a right to safety. Respect had to be part of this construction site, part of their work, not just another disparaging item on a list that was easy to ignore. Equality and respect, two words that, if applied to everyone, could have changed everything. Everyone realized that if Mark had been heard, his life wouldn't have ended so tragically. If each of them had known that their voice mattered, Harry would never have allowed himself to do such a thing. He wouldn't have dared to use his position to suppress and eliminate those who differed from him, who dared to think differently. Now there was a heavy, bitter silence on the construction site, but something new was growing in that silence. The realization that they would no longer be silent and tolerant, that everyone had the right to be treated fairly and with respect. This tragedy was a lesson for everyone. Disregard for equality and respect destroys not only the collective, but lives. And in that moment, the workers realized that they had to stand up for their right to equality, just as Mark once stood up, so that no one else would feel second class or unwanted in that place. As the day drew to a close, the workers returned more and more to thoughts of what had happened that morning. That Harry had pushed Mark off the scaffolding was no longer in doubt. But now that the tragedy had sharpened their perceptions, everyone was beginning to wonder what would happen next. Someone had to answer for this brutality. There was no way to just keep quiet about what had happened, pretend it was an accident, and carry on with work as if nothing had happened. Mark was one of them, and they realized that if they didn't get justice now, any one of them could be in his place. The hard question of who would be held responsible was beginning to become clearer. Harry, their foreman, must answer for his actions. He was more than just a strict supervisor. His cruelty was out of line, and his abuse of power had turned tragic. The workers knew that this was not just an accidental fall, not a fatal mistake. It was the result of conscious decisions by Harry, who felt entitled to decide who was worth more here and who was worth less. He had decided that he could dispose of their lives as he pleased, and Mark's tragedy was the final link in a chain of cruel acts. "Harry's got to answer for this," said Joe, standing at the edge of the scaffolding, fists clenched. His voice sounded firm and determined. He knew what he was doing. He pushed Mark because he wouldn't obey. We've all seen it. We all know it wasn't an accident. If we turn a blind eye to it now, we'll be just like him. The words ignited a quiet but determined fire in the others. They were no longer willing to accept that their lives were worthless in the eyes of men like Harry. The workers realized that if they allowed his act to go unpunished, it would mean that the cruelty and disregard for their lives would continue. "But who will take responsibility?" one of the young workers asked hesitantly. "Because if we report it, Harry will find a way to blame it on us. He'll say that we didn't take care of safety ourselves." Joe turned to him and answered, already softer but no less forcefully. "That's why we have to go together. If one goes, Harry can break him. But if we all say we saw him, that we know how he treated Mark, he won't get away with it. He will no longer have the power to hide his cruelty behind a mask of strict leadership. We will not allow Mark's memory to be tainted by lies." Joe's words gave the others strength. Everyone realized that this was a risky move. Harry was in a high position and most likely had the support of his superiors. But they knew that inaction now would mean they were willing to turn a blind eye to the murder of their colleague, willing to let cruelty continue to rule them. A sense of determination hung in the air. The workers realized that Harry must be punished, not only for Mark's sake, but for everyone else's sake, for the sake of those who would come after them. They no longer wanted to live in fear and obey a leader for whom their lives meant nothing. This responsibility for justice no longer seemed alien or dangerous. Now it was their decision, their duty, their demand that Harry answer for his cruelty and never again be able to commandeer the lives of others as if they were expendable. The loss of Mark made the workers think about the deep, painful wounds that discrimination and bias can inflict not only on an individual, but on an entire team. After all, what happened was not just an accident or a fatal mistake. It was a tragedy caused by neglect and prejudice. Mark had been victimized not only by Harry's cruelty, but also by a system in which people like him always found themselves in the position of the inconvenient. The workers remembered how Harry had always treated Mark differently and realized that there was more to it than the usual strictness. In the foreman's eyes, Mark was different, and this otherness made him less significant, less important. Harry could easily imagine a construction site without Mark, and his demands seemed to him superfluous and interfering with the process. Mark was a man of strong convictions, and his willingness to stand up for his own safety and dignity went against Harry's ideas of what a good worker should be. This bias allowed Harry not only to disregard Mark's life, but also to justify his cruelty to himself. After all, in his eyes, Mark was unequal to him. He was just an expendable resource, and therefore did not deserve the protection and respect that is usually given to their own. And it was this that caused the tragedy. Indifference to the one whom the foreman saw as a stranger allowed him to commit an act that he would never have dared to do with any of his favorites or necessary people. This discrimination, based on implicit bias, was the foundation for the mounting tension that eventually led to tragedy. Harry could have simply discussed his concerns with Mark, could have found a way to work with him, given his experience and professionalism. But instead, he saw in Mark only a challenge to his authority. And that view, devoid of human respect, had turned Mark into a victim. If Mark had been treated like the others, none of this would have happened, one of the workers muttered as they reconvened for a break. If he had been respected, he would have been with us, working and helping us. He was always ready to help, to warn us of the risks, and we didn't listen to him just because Harry thought he was too chatty. These words ignited the realization that discrimination in the workplace is more than just grievances and petty injustices. It is an endless source of tension, a constant pressure that can end in nothing but disaster. Bias and lack of respect from management can make the workplace a source of not only physical, but also moral jeopardy. And if it's not dealt with, if you let people like Harry run their courts, no one is safe. Mark was a victim of this poison, but his death awakened the workers' awareness. They realized that discrimination is not an abstract problem, but a matter of life and death that affects everyone. And now they knew that they had to fight for everyone to be equal in their rights, for everyone's voice to be heard. In the memory of Mark, and in the realization of his tragedy, the workers decided that they would no longer let prejudice and discrimination ruin their lives. The day after the tragedy, the construction site came alive, not with the usual rhythm, but with a quiet but firm decision to change the established order. The heavy silence and restrained anger that filled the workers seemed to echo with a single voice. They realized that if they kept silent now, Mark's tragedy would be in vain, and cruelty, injustice, and indifference would continue to reign in their workplace, where each of them could become the next victim. The workers came together and drafted a collective statement calling on management to review safety standards and demanding respect and fair treatment for every employee, regardless of their background or personal characteristics. The document, written in simple words, was a powerful call for change and reflected their shared desire to create a fair and safe workplace. No one should fear for their life while doing their job, Joe read, standing in front of the group of workers and holding a statement. No one should feel less valuable or less important here. We are all equally important, and our lives should not depend on someone else's preconceived notions or personal preferences. These words, simple and full of sincere truth, resonated in the hearts of everyone present. People exchanged glances, feeling the strength that came from their unity. They realized that despite their differences, everyone deserves the same respect, and everyone has the right to a safe environment where their work is valued and their lives are protected. We have to be united if we want to make a difference, Carl added. Fairness in the workplace is not just our right, It's something everyone deserves. Mark has always fought to make conditions safe for all of us, and we have a responsibility to make sure his fight is not forgotten. Inspired by his words, the workers began to tell their stories, sharing their own experiences and instances where their safety or dignity had been jeopardized. It turned out that many had similar situations. Some had suffered from silent neglect, some had been humiliated, and some constantly felt different because of prejudice from their superiors. But now, they felt it was time to say no to such conditions. In their collective call, they demanded not only punishment for Harry, but also a system that would ensure that every worker is safe and has equal rights. They called on management to conduct a thorough investigation into the incident and to consider a system to protect the rights of employees, where everyone could report violations without fear, whether they were safety issues or bias. This day was a turning point for all the workers on the site. Their call was more than just a document. It was a symbol of their willingness to fight for justice, for the right to work without fear, for respect and equality. And even though there was a long journey ahead, they knew that the memory of Mark and his resilience would always be with them. Mark's story has become a call for justice, reminding everyone that the workplace should be a place of safety and equality. For only in such an environment can people feel that they are not just performers, but true professionals whose lives and labor are truly valued. As the weeks passed, the events of that day continued to echo on the construction site. After Mark's tragedy, each of the workers felt part of a bigger, more meaningful cause. By uniting for change, they had taken the first step toward creating an environment where no one would ever again fear for their lives and dignity. Their collective statement, backed by stories and real-life examples, was heard by management, and the transformation began. Safety inspections, training, and the introduction of an anonymous complaint system so that everyone could speak out without fear of reprisal. The management, which did not ignore the mass appeal, finally recognized the problems, and measures were taken to stop discrimination and ensure that every employee was treated with dignity. Harry received the punishment he deserved. He was fired, and the case file was taken to court. This was a symbol of justice and proof that abuse of power and cruelty will not go unpunished. Each of the employees felt that Mark's voice advocating for safety and respect was not wasted. His death was a hard lesson for them, but also a catalyst for change they had previously hesitated to believe in. Their collective pain became strength, and Mark's memory became an unwavering benchmark that makes everyone remember that human life and dignity are more important than deadlines and ambitions. Standing on the construction site, now filled with new rules and approaches, Joe and the other workers often remembered Mark. They knew that his memory was alive not only in their hearts, but also in the safety and fairness measures he fought for to the last. They realized that their fight for respect and equality was just beginning, and that each day required them to stand firm and realize their responsibility. For the viewer, this story is a call to reflect on the price one must sometimes pay for indifference and injustice. Mark has become a symbol of resilience, of fighting for justice and respect for human dignity. His tragedy reminds us all that the workplace should be safe, that everyone deserves equal and dignified treatment, and that we have the power and right to demand justice wherever we are. This story is a reminder that justice begins with us, with our ability to come together for the common good, so that never again will anyone have to sacrifice life or dignity for ambition and prejudice. Dear viewers, this story raises many questions about fairness, equality, and respect in the workplace. Write in the comments what you think about this story. Have you ever faced injustice or bias in your life? Have you had situations where you had to fight for justice or stand up to discrimination? Each of you is incredibly important to us, and we appreciate each of you for being with us, for your support, and for your thoughts that you share. Your comments and feedback help us create more of these stories, raise important topics, and resonate with you. If you like this video and want to support us, please subscribe to the channel and give us a like. We will be glad to see you again to discuss important life topics together. We wish you a good day and thank you for being with us.